Well, we've all been through some extraordinary times over the last 12 months. It's been very, very difficult for so many people. But for two people within this industry, those those feelings have been heightened to a large degree. Karl Standley, the head groundsman at Wembley, well, this time last year was preparing for the what would have been the biggest football event since football came home in 1996. Obviously, that was all cancelled. And Andy Gray, the head of grounds at St George's Park, well, this time last year, I think he was still at his previous job in Southampton. So he's had a new job to take on in the middle of a pandemic. So I'm delighted to have been joined by both Karl and Andy. And where to start? Well, I think maybe we will start with Karl. This time last year, what were your feelings when everything started to shut down and you knew at that stage or still thought you had a huge tournament to prepare for?
Yeah, hi Scott. I think it was all a surprise for everyone. Suddenly the scenario that we got put into, no one's ever run a scenario like that before, where suddenly everything is shut down and stopped and you're sort of told not to go to work now. Telling a football pitch, don't grow, I need you to stay where you are for the next couple of weeks, months, or whatever the future was to look like. I think for us, we put two scenarios in place. We knew that we were going to have the Euros coming up. So again, we prepared with the reconstruction through the winter to meet the business model. And then again, I think as soon as the pandemic hit and we heard those words, about a week before, we did put a plan in place to say what would happen if. And again, we just split our team into two. And I think the first thing, making sure the team are safe, making sure they're healthy, making sure that, again, any issues in their home life we are well aware of and there to support, but also then look out the pitch. Now, luckily, our roles are wide, so we are in fresh air and we can keep each other safe and just put sort of protocols in place for when we're in the building. So, yeah, it was a bit of a difficult situation to start to manage, but I think everyone bought into the mindset of, right, we need to keep each other safe, we need to have good communication, and then again, I think looking forward to what the next few months were to hold. No one knew if this would be a month or two or three, or what about when's football coming back was the question everyone was asking, but we just knew at the stadium, right, keep this pitch as healthy as possible, and get it ready for whenever football was to come back, and that was really our plan.
For work on the pitch, were there plans that had to be put on hold, or that work already been carried out and will it have to be repeated going forward into this year?
Yeah, luckily the reconstruction was through the winter. So the first game was the Carabao Cup final on the 1st of March 2020. And to think back then, full capacity and a good final that we had, and then that was it. The next two games were England internationals. So again, the main project for us was over the line, ready for Euros, as well as a few others around the stadium too. So by that point, I think we just put everything on hold. But again, we looked at the practices that we undertake. So things like regular raking, the regular verticutting. We're constantly on the pitch with rake, just trying to thin it out, keep it as healthy as possible, and also make the plant work. But we also sort of thought that, again, it's hard I'll probably say, for a lot of grounds teams to stop and to sit still. So again, once we got into a comfortable area, we then decided we'll run scenarios. So again, we were looking at, well, how quickly can we do 4 rakes off the playing surface, and then how quickly can we recover? So we ran a few scenarios during lockdown as well, so just to give us a bit more of an understanding about the data that we were getting back from the pitch and the cultural practices that we could undertake, ready for whenever football came back, and also for potentially for the Euros too.
It was interesting. I was speaking to Neil Stubley at Wimbledon not so very long ago and asking about the chances of Wimbledon this year. And he said, well, either it'd be no fans, all the fans, or some fans. But in all reality, none of these particularly affected him because his job was to maintain the courts just the same way. Now, I'd imagine that's a similar scenario for you.
Yeah, it was. Minimal people within the stadium. For my role, again, for 2 days of the week, I did work from home, but also then came in and swapped over with other team members to ensure we had minimal people on site and that we weren't all in the building at the same time. That was it. Football, sort of, the pitches did continue. Mother Nature doesn't have an out of office. So again, we always talk about sort of both myself and Andy from a football background, in the Premier League, you could have, from Championship and other leagues, you could have a Boxing Day game. So even on Christmas Day, it's still growing. And for us, it was really just carry on, but just put that sort of protective bubble around the team and carry on the good work.
Now, Andy, this time last year, your situation was completely different. You were a different employer, a different part of the country. How did you look forward to the next few months going forward? Were you obviously putting preparations or thoughts in place for Southampton, and then midway through a complete change for you?
Indeed, yeah. So much like obviously when it all stopped, nobody had a clue what was going on. I remember at that time, the Premier League all football was being suspended for 2 weeks, and the next fixture was due for like April the 4th or something like that. Obviously, that then got called off, and it went to later in April, and then it went further on, and eventually got going again mid to late June, I think it was. So it was quite tricky at that time to know what we could and should do in terms of the pitches, both at the stadium and at the training ground, because if we'd have known on March 23rd that we had until essentially June the 23rd, we would have ripped them all up and renovated there and then. But we did it on March 23rd. We had 2 weeks. So, okay, we just maintain until they come back. 2 weeks became sort of 4 weeks and 6 weeks and so on. So I remember there was a lot of chat amongst the ground staff around the country as to what to do with renovation wise, because if it does get going again in June, is there time to then renovate before next season? Because even at that time, we did the 1920 season, and we go straight to 2021 season. So most of us, including us, renovated our stadium pitches middle to end of April. And once it got going in June, the teams wanted like a pre-season game, training sessions, etc. So we renovated end of April. We see 1st of May, and we're playing on the 5th of June. So we've got a pitch back in 5 weeks, basically, which is not quite as short as what Karl's done most years, to be fair, but it's certainly the shortest I've ever done it in. But it was doable. And training ground wise, we didn't actually renovate a single training pitch fully because we just weren't able to. We just didn't have that window. Got done what I would term half, some a quarter, and some didn't at all. And speaking to the things at Southampton sort of throughout the season, all done. Those 2 pitches we didn't get renovated have struggled. If there's any experience that you have as positive out of sort of a bad experience, if you like, is that it proves why we do what we do in renovation times, because people often look at you like you're crazy, man. What are you ripping up that for? That's a perfectly good pitch. And the answer is, well, if you don't, it won't be like that this time next year. And so this season, last summer, this season has proved that it's the perfect opportunity to prove that that's why you do what you do.
I've heard that comment made through a number of different sports, golf one of them as well, that it has put much more of an emphasis on the conditions and the playing surfaces, which can only be good going forward, as you've said. So that is one of the few silver linings around a very dark cloud. Now, the FA came calling, and your new job started in the middle of the pandemic.
It did, yeah.
And presumably relocating as well. It must have been a tricky time for you, all in all.
I wouldn't say tricky, because the word I would describe as exciting. As I said in a few previous sort of interviews that I've done, it's the FA, it's England, it's basically it was just pure excitement of what I wanted to do. Location-wise, I haven't actually moved up lock, stock and barrel. I live in Southampton, that's where my family are, and I just commute up once a week. I rented accommodation in Burton, and then obviously go home for weekends still. So in terms of that, it was just simply a case of paying a monthly rent. I haven't moved furniture or my family or anything else like that. So that was actually quite seamless, to be honest. But yeah, in terms of actually starting mid-pandemic, I started on the 1st of September when arguably the pandemic was at its least severe, shall we say. And then once November hit, lockdown 2, the tier system through December, and then obviously lockdown 3 in January. Since November the 1st, it's been quite tough, I have to say, but you just get on with it. And as I've said all along, there's plenty of people working what I'm lucky that I've got what I've got and do.
Now, starting when you did, you've given you what, 9 months until it ramps up for the Euros, and St George's Park will be the hub, of the whole England's campaign to win the Euros. That's a good amount of time for you to get your feet under the table, but by the same token, you're having to learn where the toilets are, where you go to book your holidays, where all these sorts of procedures that are in place for normal working, you've got to get that on, as well as look at all these lovely pitches that you've got at St George's Park and make sure they're tip top.
No, you're dead right. It has been a learning curve all round. I was at my previous employer for 22 years. So essentially, I think out of roughly 350 employees, I was the third longest serving. So I've gone from everybody coming into employment knowing that I was there to being the new person coming into everybody else. I've never experienced that before, so that in itself was a new experience. But in terms of obviously the pandemic with nobody being around, that has allowed me to get to know the site, where things are, how things work. It's just I just haven't met people in the flesh, unfortunately, which most of these people I would have met within the first sort of 2-3 weeks. I just met a couple of the England backroom staff last week for the first time, and again I met them 6 months ago. So you see them on video calls, etc., but it isn't the same. But yeah, in terms of the pitch, I started in September. Very first day was the September international camp. With October, November, through the winter, last week's camp. So I've had a good amount of time to get used to the pitches and know what we're going to do ready for June, when, like you say, we host base camp for the Euros, which is really exciting.
Now, do you go in to sort of pick up the reins from the previous incumbent, or do you go in there with a fresh sheet of paper and with your own views on how you're going to do things? Is it more prescriptive, or have you got a free hand to enforce what you want to do?
On the whole, it's free hand to do what I want to do. It's a strange situation because there was 9 months in between Scott, my predecessor, leaving and me starting, and in that interim, it was being looked after by essentially what was now my teams. So there was no handover, obviously, at all. And in the middle of that was obviously the pandemic as well. So it wasn't a normal handover, but I like to think that I obviously got the job on the back of what I'd achieved at Southampton, both pitch-wise, but staff-wise, business-wise. You want to look at any angle that you come at of the job these days. So that's what I've looked to impose since I've come to the FA at St George's Park, to essentially continue carrying what I was doing at Southampton, but up here instead.